The trading ship Celestial Pride moved through space like a silver arrow cutting through black silk. Inside its gleaming corridors, Zara pressed her pale blue face against the viewing window and watched the human colony grow larger. New Terra looked like a small green jewel floating in the darkness. "Remember your place, daughter," her father said behind her. Commander Vex was tall even for a Velkin, with the perfect bone structure and flawless skin that marked their noble bloodline. "We stop here only for supplies and trade. Do not embarrass our family name." Zara nodded, though she felt excitement bubbling in her chest. At 16 cycles old, she had finally reached the age where she could choose her first companion. It was a tradition among young Velkins of high birth, a way to learn responsibility while gaining a useful servant. The Velkin Empire had conquered dozens of worlds, and humans were considered one of the more interesting species they had encountered. Not the strongest or the smartest, but adaptable enough to be useful. Many Velkin families kept humans as gardeners, mechanics, or entertainers. "The selection will be simple," her mother added, smoothing Zara's silver hair with long, elegant fingers. "Choose one that is strong and obedient. Avoid the troublemakers. Your cousin Nira picked a human that kept trying to escape. Very embarrassing." The Celestial Pride docked at New Terra's small space station. Zara had never seen a human settlement before. Everything looked rough and functional, built more for survival than beauty. The corridors were narrow, the walls were gray metal, and strange smells filled the air. "Primitive," her father muttered as they walked through the station. "But they do have some useful resources." The human officials who greeted them were nervous and polite. They wore simple blue uniforms and kept their heads down when speaking to the Velkins. Zara noticed how different they looked from each other. Some had dark skin, others light, with hair in many colors and styles. Velkins all looked similar, which her teacher said was a sign of their genetic perfection. "Welcome to New Terra," said the station commander, a middle-aged woman with gray hair. "We have prepared the selection area as requested. 25 specimens are available for your consideration." Zara's stomach twisted slightly at the word specimens, but she said nothing. This was how things worked. The strong ruled the weak. The Velkin Empire brought order to chaos. They were led to a large room with white walls and bright lights. Humans sat or stood in various positions, each wearing a simple brown outfit with a number on the chest. Most looked scared or angry. Some stared at the floor. Others watched the Velkins with barely hidden hatred. "Excellent selection," Zara's father said, walking among the humans like he was examining livestock. "This one has good muscle development. That one appears intelligent. And this female has the bone structure for heavy labor." The Velkin merchants who traveled with them began discussing prices and practical considerations. Zara tried to listen, but her attention kept wandering to the humans themselves. She had studied their species in school, but seeing them in person was different. They were so varied, young and old, tall and short, with faces that showed so many different emotions. Fear, anger, sadness, determination. Even in captivity, they seemed alive in a way that fascinated her. "What do you think, daughter?" her father asked. "Any catch your interest?" Zara walked slowly through the room, trying to appear confident and mature. Most of the humans avoided eye contact, but a few met her gaze directly. One man looked like he wanted to attack her. Another woman seemed to be pleading silently for mercy. Then she noticed him. In the far corner of the room, a young human sat cross-legged on the floor. He had brown hair and ordinary features, not particularly strong or handsome by any measure. What made him different was what he was doing. He was reading. While every other human in the room was focused on their captors or their fear, this one had a small notebook open in his lap. He was writing something with a tiny pencil, occasionally looking up at a small green plant he had somehow managed to keep with him. "Interesting," Zara murmured, moving closer. The human looked up as she approached. His eyes were brown and calm. He didn't look scared or angry. He looked curious. "What are you writing?" she asked in the human language. Her tutors had insisted she learn several alien tongues. The human seemed surprised that she had spoken to him directly. "I'm making notes about this plant," he said quietly. "It's a type of moss that grows on our ships. I wanted to understand why it thrives in artificial light." "You study plants?" "I'm a botanist. My name is Ben." He closed the notebook carefully. "I take care of growing things." Zara's father appeared beside her. "This one?" He frowned as he looked Ben over. "It appears weak. No obvious skills. Perhaps you should consider one of the stronger specimens. What can you do? Zara asked Ben directly. Ben thought for a moment. I can make things grow. I can fix problems with food production. I can create medicines from plants. I can turn empty land into gardens. Modest claims, one of the Velkin merchants said with a laugh. Humans always exaggerate their abilities. But something in Ben's quiet confidence intrigued Zara. While other humans had boasted about their strength or skills, Ben simply stated facts. No drama, no desperation, just calm certainty. This one shows no proper fear, her mother observed. It may be defective. Zara studied Ben more carefully. Her mother was right, he didn't seem properly afraid. The other humans were clearly terrified, even the ones trying to hide it. But Ben looked like he was solving a puzzle in his head. Are you not scared? She asked him. Ben considered the question seriously. I'm concerned about my future, he said. But fear clouds judgment. I prefer to understand situations before deciding how to react. Arrogant, her father muttered. Perhaps some time in the discipline chambers will teach it respect. Something about that comment made Zara uncomfortable, though she couldn't say why. She looked around the room at the other humans again. The strong ones, the smart ones, the ones her family would approve of. But her eyes kept returning to Ben. I choose this one, she said suddenly. Her parents exchanged glances. Are you certain, daughter? Her mother asked. It seems rather ordinary. Yes, Zara said, surprising herself with how sure she sounded. I choose him. The transaction was completed quickly. Ben was given new clothes, a simple gray outfit that marked him as Velkin property. He was allowed to keep his notebook and plant, though the merchant seemed amused by this request. As they prepared to leave New Terra, Zara watched Ben from across the ship's cargo bay, where temporary quarters had been set up for him. He had arranged his few possessions neatly, and was already examining the ship's lighting systems with professional interest. You have made an interesting choice, daughter, her father said, joining her at the observation window. I hope you do not regret it. What will happen to the others? Zara asked, thinking of the humans left behind. They will be sold to other families or put to work in the mines. The strong ones will survive. The weak ones will not. Natural selection. Zara nodded, though something about his words made her stomach feel strange. In school, they had learned that the Velkin Empire brought order and purpose to chaotic species. It was a kindness, really. Humans were much better off under Velkin guidance than struggling alone on primitive worlds. Over the next few days of travel, Zara observed Ben carefully. He was given basic servant duties, cleaning, maintaining equipment, helping in the food preparation areas. He performed every task efficiently and without complaint, but he also did things that weren't required. When the ship's air recycling system developed a strange smell, Ben identified the problem as bacterial buildup and suggested a cleaning solution made from common medical supplies. When the cook complained that fresh vegetables were wilting too quickly, Ben reorganized the storage area to improve air circulation. Most surprising of all, when Zara's prized collection of Velkin orchids began showing signs of disease, Ben asked permission to examine them. Your plants are suffering from mineral deficiency, he told her after a careful inspection. The soil mixture is too pure. In nature, plants need many different nutrients, including some that seem like impurities. Impurities? Zara was confused. But purity is perfection. We breed out impurities? Ben looked thoughtful. Maybe that works for some things. But for plants, diversity usually makes them stronger. Perfect conditions can actually make them weak. This was a strange idea to Zara. Everything in Velkin society emphasized purity and perfection. Their bloodlines, their culture, their technology, all designed to eliminate weakness and chaos. Show me, she said. Ben created a new soil mixture using materials from the ship's waste recycling system. He added trace elements that Velkin gardening manuals would have considered contamination. Within days, Zara's orchids began to recover. How did you know to do that? She asked, watching the flowers regain their color. Experience, and Ben said simply. I've worked with many different kinds of plants. Each one teaches you something new. As the ship traveled toward the Velkin homeworld, Zara found herself spending more time talking with Ben. Her parents disapproved, but she told them it was important to understand her servant's capabilities. Ben told her about his work on New Terra, where he had helped develop new farming techniques to feed the growing colony. He described plants that could grow in harsh conditions, medicines that could be made from common weeds, and ways to turn barren ground into productive gardens. More interesting to Zara were the stories about human culture. Ben described communities where people worked together to solve problems, where different ideas were welcomed rather than suppressed, where failure was seen as a learning opportunity rather than a flaw to be eliminated. Sounds chaotic, Zara said, though she found the stories fascinating. Sometimes, Ben agreed. But chaos can be creative. When you mix different elements together, sometimes you get something better than what you started with. It was the same principle he had used to save her orchids, Zara realized. 3 weeks into the journey, the ship's main food production unit began failing. The hydroponic gardens that fed the crew were producing smaller and weaker crops each day. The head gardener, a Velkin specialist with perfect credentials, tried every standard solution. Nothing worked. The system is too perfectly balanced, Ben observed when Zara asked his opinion. There's no room for adaptation when conditions change. What would you do differently? Ben was quiet for a long moment. I would need to see the full system to make suggestions. But I think the problem is that everything is too controlled. Plants need some chaos to stay healthy. Zara convinced her father to let Ben examine the food production area. The head gardener was insulted by the suggestion that a human pet might solve a problem that defeated Velkin science. But the alternative was reduced rations for the rest of the journey. Ben spent hours studying the hydroponic systems, taking notes and asking questions. The Velkin gardener answered with barely concealed irritation, clearly expecting the primitive human to be overwhelmed by their advanced technology. Instead, Ben made a simple suggestion. You should introduce controlled variations into the growing conditions, he said. Different light cycles for different plants, slight changes in nutrient levels, small amounts of beneficial bacteria in the water supply. Contamination is forbidden, the head gardener snapped. These systems are designed for optimal purity. Then they're designed to fail, Ben said quietly. Life needs diversity to survive. The head gardener refused to implement Ben's suggestions, but Zara had heard enough. That night she used her authority as a noble's daughter to give Ben access to a small section of the growing area. If you're wrong, you'll be punished, she warned him. I understand, Ben said, but I'm not wrong. Working quietly over several days, Ben made small changes to one corner of the hydroponic system. He introduced carefully controlled variations in everything from lighting to nutrient flow. He even added tiny amounts of beneficial microorganisms that the Velkin systems had been designed to eliminate. The results were remarkable. Within a week, the plants in Ben's section were growing faster and producing more food than anywhere else in the ship. The vegetables were larger, more flavorful, and more nutritious than anything the perfect Velkin system had created. Word of the improvement spread through the ship. The captain himself came to inspect Ben's work. The head gardener protested that the success was temporary, that the contamination would eventually cause problems. But as the ship continued its journey to HFY Prime, Ben's modified systems continued to outperform the original design. By the time they reached the homeworld, even the most skeptical crew members had to admit that the humans' chaotic approach worked better than Velkin perfection. Interesting, Commander Vex said to his daughter as they prepared to disembark. Your pet has proven more useful than expected. Zara watched Ben pack his few belongings, including the notebook that had grown considerably thicker during the journey. She had chosen him on impulse, drawn by his strange calmness in a room full of fear. Now she was beginning to understand that his calm came from something deeper than she had realized. Ben wasn't just unafraid. He was confident, not in his own superiority, but in his ability to understand and adapt to any situation. Where Velkin sought to impose perfect order, Ben looked for natural patterns and worked with them rather than against them. As they walked down the ship's ramp onto HFY Prime, Zara realized that her simple choice of a companion had become something much more complicated. She had thought she was selecting a servant. Instead, she might have chosen a teacher. The alien girl was beginning to understand that choosing a human meant choosing to see the universe in an entirely different way. HFY Prime was the most beautiful world Zara had ever seen, though she had never known anywhere else. Crystal towers reached toward purple skies, their surfaces reflecting the light of 2 golden suns. Every street was perfectly planned, every building designed with mathematical precision. Gardens filled with identical flowers created patterns that pleased the eye and demonstrated the power of Velkan control over nature. Ben walked beside Zara through the capital city, his brown eyes taking in everything with quiet interest. Other humans hurried past carrying packages or cleaning equipment, their heads down and movements quick. They wore the same gray uniforms that marked them as servants of the Empire. "Your world is very organized," Ben said, watching a group of Velkan children walk past in perfect formation, their silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. "Of course," Zara replied. "Order creates beauty. Chaos creates only problems." Ben nodded politely, but she noticed him studying the identical flower beds with a thoughtful expression. The transport vehicle brought them to the family estate, a massive complex of white stone buildings surrounded by formal gardens. Zara's grandfather, Lord Caney, waited for them in the main courtyard. He was ancient even by Velkan standards, his pale skin almost translucent and his silver hair flowing like water down his back. "So this is the pet you selected," he said, examining Ben with sharp purple eyes. "Unremarkable appearance. What can it do?" "He understands plants," Zara said. "He improved our ship's food production systems during the journey." "Did he now?" Lord Caney walked around Ben like he was inspecting a piece of machinery. "Tell me, human, what do you think of our gardens?" Ben looked around the courtyard at the perfectly arranged flower beds, each one containing rows of identical blooms in precise geometric patterns. "They're very neat," he said carefully. "Neat?" Lord Kane's voice carried a dangerous edge. "These gardens represent thousands of years of Velkan horticultural science. Each plant has been bred for perfection. Every flower is identical in size, color, and form. There is no chaos, no waste, no imperfection." "Yes, sir," Ben said. "They're certainly very controlled." Something in his tone made Zara look at him more closely. Ben's face was respectful, but his eyes held the same expression she had seen when he studied her sick orchids on the ship. "You will be housed with the other human servants," Lord Caney continued. "Your duties will include maintaining the estate's secondary gardens and assisting with food preparation. Zara will supervise your work as part of her education and management." That evening, Zara showed Ben to the servants' quarters, a series of small rooms behind the main estate. The other humans who worked for her family were polite but distant, quickly returning to their own activities after brief introductions. "They seem afraid," Ben observed as they walked back toward the main house. "They understand their place," Zara corrected. "The Empire provides them with purpose and security. Before we found them, humans lived in chaos, fighting among themselves and struggling to survive." "Is that what you learned in school?" The question surprised her. "Of course. It's history." Ben was quiet for a moment. "History can look different depending on who tells the story." Over the following days, Ben began his duties on the estate. Zara watched him work in the secondary gardens, areas where less important plants were grown for practical purposes rather than beauty. He approached each task with the same calm efficiency she had observed on the ship. But again, he did more than what was required. When he noticed that certain vegetable plants were producing smaller crops than expected, he spent his free time studying soil samples and light patterns. When the kitchen staff complained about frequent spoilage of fresh ingredients, he reorganized the storage areas and suggested changes to preservation methods. Most significantly, when Lord Kane's prized meditation garden began showing signs of a mysterious plant disease, Ben asked permission to investigate. "The human thinks it can solve a problem that has defeated our best botanists?" Lord Caney asked when Zara brought the request to him. "He solved the problems on our ship," Zara reminded him. "Very well. But if he fails or if he damages anything further, he will face appropriate punishment." Ben spent 3 days examining the meditation garden, a circular space filled with rare flowers that were said to promote mental clarity and spiritual peace. The plants were turning brown at the edges of their leaves and several had begun to wilt, despite perfect care from the estate's master gardener. "What do you think is wrong?" Zara asked, finding Ben kneeling beside one of the affected plants with his notebook open. "The same thing that was wrong with your orchids on the ship," Ben said, "and the same thing that was wrong with the food production systems. Everything is too perfect. That doesn't make sense. How can something be too perfect?" Ben sat back on his heels and looked around the garden. "See how every plant is the same height? Same spacing? Same growing conditions? It looks beautiful, but it's not natural. In nature, plants grow at different rates and compete for resources. That competition makes them stronger. Competition creates conflict, Zara said, repeating what she had learned. Conflict creates chaos. Sometimes, Ben agreed. But it also creates adaptation. When plants face challenges, they develop new ways to survive. When everything is exactly the same, they lose that ability. He pointed to the diseased plants. These flowers have been bred for beauty and uniformity. They're genetically identical. When one gets sick, they all get sick, because none of them have developed resistance to anything. Zara struggled to understand this concept. But our scientists eliminated the weak traits, made them perfect. They eliminated diversity, Ben said gently, and diversity is what allows life to survive when conditions change. That night, Zara lay in her bed thinking about Ben's words. Everything in Velkan society was built on the principle of perfection, through uniformity. Their bloodlines, their culture, their technology, all designed to eliminate variation and chaos, but Ben was suggesting that variation and chaos might actually be necessary. The next morning brought news that sent shockwaves through the capital city. The primary food production facilities that fed Velkara Prime were failing. The same disease affecting Lord Kane's meditation garden had spread to the massive agricultural complexes that sustained millions of Velkans. Emergency broadcasts filled the communication networks. The Emperor's chief scientists appeared on public screens, assuring the population that the situation was under control and that traditional methods would solve the crisis. But as days passed, the situation only grew worse. Zara found Ben in the estate's secondary gardens, working with a group of plants that seemed unaffected by the spreading disease. They were older varieties, less perfect than the modern strains, with irregular flowers and varying growth patterns. "Why aren't these plants sick?" she asked. "Because they're not genetically identical," Ben explained. "Some of them have natural resistance to the disease. In a diverse population, even if many individuals get sick, some will survive to reproduce and pass on their resistance." "Could you use these plants to fix the food production facilities?" Ben was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe, but it would require changing the entire approach to agriculture. Instead of perfect uniformity, you'd need to accept diversity. Instead of complete control, you'd need to work with natural processes." "That sounds like chaos. It sounds like survival." That evening, reports arrived that the food crisis was worse than initially announced. Production was down by 60% and continuing to fall. The Emperor's scientists had tried every approved method, but nothing was working. Lord Caney called a family meeting in his private study. Maps of the agricultural facilities covered the walls, marked with red symbols showing the spread of the plant disease. "The situation is becoming critical," he said grimly. "If production continues to decline, we will face widespread hunger within months. The Emperor has authorized emergency measures, including the possibility of importing food from conquered worlds." "What about Ben's ideas?" Zara asked suddenly. Her family turned to stare at her. "What ideas?" her father demanded. "He thinks the problem is that all our plants are too similar. He says diversity would make them stronger." "Nonsense," Lord Caney snapped. "Diversity is weakness. Our agricultural systems are the pinnacle of Velkan science." "But they're failing," Zara pointed out. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Finally, her mother spoke. "Zara, you cannot seriously suggest that a human pet understands more about agriculture than our greatest scientists." "He saved our ship's food production," Zara said. "He identified the problem in your meditation garden. Maybe we should listen to his ideas." "Absolutely not," her father said firmly. "We will not risk our civilization on the primitive theories of an inferior species." But that night, Zara made a decision that would change everything. She went to Ben's quarters and woke him quietly. "I want you to show me exactly what you think could save our food production." Ben looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "It won't be easy, and it won't look like what your people expect." They spent the next several hours in the estate storage areas, where Ben showed her seeds and plant samples he had been collecting during his work. Unlike the perfect uniform varieties used in modern Velkan agriculture, these were older strains with natural variation. "This is what your food plants looked like before they were improved," Ben explained, showing her seeds of different sizes and colors. "They're not as pretty or as uniform, but they're much more resilient." "How do you know this will work?" "Because I've seen it work. On New Terra, we faced similar problems when we tried to create perfect growing conditions. The only solution was to embrace diversity and work with natural processes instead of trying to control everything. Zara stared at the collection of imperfect seeds. Everything in her education told her that uniformity and control were the keys to success. But everything she had observed about Ben told her that his unconventional approaches somehow produced better results. What would you need to prove your theory? A test area, permission to grow these varieties alongside the current ones, and time to show the results. Zara knew that getting official permission would be impossible. Her family and the government would never approve such a radical departure from established methods. But she also knew that the current approach was failing catastrophically. The next morning, she made another decision that surprised even herself. Using her authority as Lord Kane's granddaughter, she gave Ben access to a section of the estate's experimental gardens. It was a restricted area, where new varieties were sometimes tested before approval for wider use. If anyone asks, you're conducting research under my supervision, she told him. If this fails, I'll take responsibility. And if it succeeds? Zara looked at the dying plants in the main gardens, then at the healthy diversity in Ben's seed collection. If it succeeds, maybe I'll finally understand what it really means to choose a human. Ben worked with quiet determination over the following weeks. He planted his diverse seed varieties in careful patterns, mixing different strains together instead of keeping them separate. He introduced beneficial insects and microorganisms that Velkin systems normally eliminated. He created what looked like chaos but followed principles that he assured Zara would prove themselves. Meanwhile, the food crisis continued to worsen. Production facilities across the planet were shutting down as the disease spread unchecked. Emergency rationing was introduced. Protests began in some of the outer cities. The Emperor's scientists grew increasingly desperate, trying more extreme versions of their traditional approaches. They sterilized entire growing areas and replanted with the most perfect specimens available. The disease killed those plants even faster. Sir, Zara said to her grandfather one evening, as they watched news reports of the spreading crisis, maybe it's time to consider alternative approaches. Lord Kane's face was grim. The Emperor has authorized a complete restructuring of our agricultural systems. We will rebuild with even more perfect specimens, grown in completely sterile conditions. But that's the same approach. That's been failing. It's the only approach that maintains our standards of excellence. Zara realized then that the Velkin leadership would rather face starvation than admit that their philosophy of perfection might be flawed. They would continue trying the same failed methods rather than consider that a human servant might understand something they had missed. That night, she made her most difficult decision yet. She sent a message to the Emperor's Emergency Council, requesting permission to present an alternative solution to the food crisis. She used every bit of influence her family name carried, calling in favors and making promises she hoped she could keep. To her surprise, she received a response within hours. The council would grant her a brief audience, though they made it clear this was likely a waste of time. "What are you planning?" Ben asked when she told him about the meeting. "I'm going to tell them about your work, about diversity and natural resilience, about the test gardens you've been growing." Ben looked troubled. "Zara, if they reject these ideas, they might punish you for even suggesting them, and they'll definitely punish me." "I know," she said, "but people are going to starve if we don't try something different, and you're the only person I know who actually understands how to fix this." The council meeting was held in the Emperor's palace, in a room with walls of black stone and ceiling that seemed to stretch into infinity. 12 of the most powerful Velkins in the Empire sat behind a curved table, their perfect faces showing various degrees of skepticism and irritation. "You have 5 minutes," the council leader announced. "Present your alternative solution." Zara had prepared carefully for this moment, but standing before the most powerful beings in her world made her voice shake as she began. "Honored council members, I believe the food crisis cannot be solved by improving our current methods. It requires a completely different approach." "Explain," one of the counselors said curtly. "The disease is spreading because all our food plants are genetically identical. When one gets sick, they all get sick. The solution is to introduce genetic diversity back into our agricultural systems." Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the council. "Genetic diversity means imperfection," another counselor said. "We spent centuries eliminating such weaknesses." With respect, honored counselor, I believe we eliminated our greatest strength. Zara's voice grew steadier as she continued. I have observed test gardens where diverse plant varieties show natural resistance to the disease. They may not be as uniform or as beautiful as our current plants, but they survive where perfect specimens die. Who created these test gardens? The council leader demanded. Zara took a deep breath. A human servant named Ben working under my supervision. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. You are suggesting that we base the survival of our civilization on the theories of a human pet? I'm suggesting that we consider solutions that work, regardless of their source. The council members exchanged glances filled with disbelief and anger. Finally, the leader spoke again. Young Zara, you are clearly confused about the natural order of things. Humans are servants. They follow instructions. They do not create solutions to problems that defeat Velkan science. But what if they can? Zara asked desperately. What if there are things we can learn from them? Impossible, the leader said firmly. This audience is concluded. Return to your family and reflect on the proper relationship between superior and inferior species. As guards moved to escort her from the room, Zara made one final attempt. The test gardens are producing healthy crops while everything else dies. Whatever you think about humans, the results speak for themselves. Enough, the leader commanded. You will cease this embarrassing display immediately. But as Zara left the palace, she noticed that one of the younger council members had remained behind, speaking quietly with the leader. She couldn't hear their words, but she caught the man, glancing in her direction with an expression that seemed more thoughtful than dismissive. 3 days later, she received an unexpected visitor. Counselor Dex was younger than the other council members, with the sharp intelligence and careful manner of someone who had risen to power through ability rather than just bloodline. He arrived at the estate alone, without the usual ceremony that accompanied official visits. I want to see these test gardens, he said without preamble. Zara led him through the estate to the experimental area where Ben had been working. The contrast was immediately obvious. While the formal gardens showed clear signs of disease and decline, Ben's diverse plantings were thriving. Explain what I'm seeing, Counselor Dex said, studying the healthy crops with intense interest. Zara called Ben over and asked him to describe his methods. Ben spoke respectfully but clearly, explaining the principles of genetic diversity, natural selection, and adaptive resilience. He showed examples of how different plant varieties supported each other, how beneficial insects controlled harmful ones, and how the apparent chaos actually created a more stable and productive system. This contradicts everything we've been taught about agricultural science, Counselor Dex said when Ben finished. Yes, sir, Ben replied, but it works. Counselor Dex spent several hours examining the test gardens, asking detailed questions and taking careful notes. Finally, he turned to Zara with a grave expression. If these methods prove successful on a larger scale, they could save our civilization, he said. But implementing them would require admitting that our fundamental assumptions about perfection and control have been wrong. That's not a conclusion the Council will accept easily. What's the alternative? Zara asked. Starvation, Counselor Dex said bluntly. Current projections show total agricultural collapse within 6 months if the disease continues spreading at its current rate. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the thriving diversity of Ben's gardens. I'm going to propose a limited trial. A single agricultural facility will be converted to these new methods. If it succeeds, we'll expand the program. If it fails, we'll return to traditional approaches. And if the Council refuses, then I'll do it without their approval and face the consequences later. The trial facility was located outside the capital city, a medium-sized complex that had been shut down when the disease killed all its crops. Ben worked with a team of Velkan technicians to implement his diverse planting strategies, though many of them clearly considered the project a waste of time. Zara spent every day at the facility, officially supervising Ben's work but actually learning more about his approach to solving problems. She watched him adapt his methods to Velkan technology, finding ways to introduce natural diversity into artificial growing systems. How do you know this will work? she asked as they watched technicians plant the first mixed crops. I don't know for certain, Ben admitted, but I know that the current approach definitely won't work. Sometimes you have to try something different, even if you're not sure it will succeed. That sounds terrifying. Ben smiled. It is, a little. But it's also exciting. When you embrace uncertainty, you open up possibilities you never imagined. The results began showing within weeks. While other facilities continued to report crop failures, the trial site produced healthy, disease-resistant plants. The yields weren't as uniform as traditional Vulcan agriculture, but they were consistently higher and more stable. Word of the success spread quickly through the scientific community. Other counselors demanded to inspect the facility. Agricultural specialists arrived from across the empire to study Ben's methods. Most importantly, the Emperor himself announced a visit to see this interesting experiment. Emperor Valen was the most perfect Vulcan Zara had ever seen. Tall and elegant, with flawless features and a presence that commanded absolute respect. He arrived with a large entourage of scientists and advisors, all expecting to see another failed attempt to solve the crisis. Instead, they found fields of thriving crops growing in patterns that looked chaotic, but produced remarkable results. Explain this to me, the Emperor commanded, addressing Ben directly. Ben bowed respectfully, then began describing his approach with the same calm confidence Zara had first noticed in the human holding facility. He spoke about diversity as strength, about working with natural processes rather than trying to control them completely, about the importance of adaptability in changing conditions. The Emperor listened in silence, occasionally asking sharp questions that Ben answered without hesitation. Finally, the ruler of the Vulcan Empire turned to his assembled advisors. How long would it take to convert our agricultural systems to these methods? The chief agricultural minister looked uncomfortable. Your Majesty, these techniques contradict our fundamental principles of genetic purity and technological control. I'm not asking about principles, the Emperor said coldly. I'm asking about survival. How long? If we committed all resources to the conversion, perhaps 2 years for major facilities. But the risk is that we might have to admit we were wrong about something. The Emperor interrupted. The alternative is that our civilization starves to death while maintaining its principles. He looked around at the thriving fields one more time, then back at Ben. Human, you will oversee the conversion process. You will have whatever resources and authority you need. Your Majesty, one of the advisors protested, surely you cannot place a human in charge of our agricultural systems. The Emperor's voice carried a note of dangerous warning. I am placing the individual who solved our crisis in charge of implementing the solution. If you have a problem with that individual's species, you are welcome to resign your position. The advisor fell silent immediately. Over the following months, Ben worked with teams of Vulcan scientists to convert agricultural facilities across the empire. It was challenging work, requiring not just technical changes but fundamental shifts in thinking about how complex systems should operate. Zara worked beside him, officially as his supervisor, but increasingly as his partner in managing the massive undertaking. She found herself learning not just about agriculture, but about entirely different ways of approaching problems. You were right, she told Ben one evening, as they reviewed progress reports from facilities across 3-star systems. Choosing a human meant choosing a completely different way of seeing things. Not just different, Ben said thoughtfully. More flexible, more willing to adapt, more comfortable with uncertainty. Those things used to frighten me. They still frighten me sometimes, Ben admitted, but I've learned that fear of uncertainty causes more problems than uncertainty itself. Zara looked at the reports showing healthy crop yields from converted facilities, while unconverted ones continued to fail. My people spent centuries trying to eliminate uncertainty and chaos. We thought that was strength. It can be in the right circumstances. But when conditions change, rigidity becomes weakness. The strongest systems are the ones that can bend without breaking. As the agricultural conversion continued, other aspects of Vulcan society began to change as well. Scientists started questioning whether genetic uniformity was really superior in all circumstances. Engineers began experimenting with designs that incorporated controlled variability. Even artists started exploring the beauty that could be found in imperfection and asymmetry. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Traditional factions argued that the empire was losing its essential character, that accepting chaos and imperfection was a step toward barbarism. Some demanded that the agricultural crisis be solved through more extreme applications of traditional methods rather than abandoning Vulcan principles. But the results were undeniable. Facilities using Ben's diverse approaches not only survived the disease crisis, but produced better yields than the old systems had, even before the disease appeared. The Empire's food supply became more stable and more abundant than it had been in generations. A year after the crisis began, Emperor Valen held a ceremony to officially recognize the success of the agricultural conversion program. Ben stood before the assembled nobles and scientists, no longer wearing the gray uniform of a servant, but dressed in robes that marked him as an advisor to the imperial court. 1 year ago, our civilization faced extinction, the emperor announced. We were saved not by perfecting our existing methods, but by learning from someone we had dismissed as inferior. This human taught us that strength comes not from eliminating all weaknesses, but from maintaining the flexibility to adapt when conditions change. The emperor paused, looking directly at Ben. He taught us that choosing to listen to different perspectives, even from unexpected sources, can mean the difference between survival and destruction. After the ceremony, Zara walked with Ben through the palace gardens, which had been redesigned using his principles of beneficial diversity. Instead of perfect geometric patterns, the gardens now showed controlled variety that was somehow more beautiful than the rigid uniformity they had replaced. "Do you ever regret choosing me?" Ben asked. Zara considered the question seriously. A year ago, she had been a sheltered young noble who believed unquestioningly in Vulcan superiority. Now she was helping to manage the transformation of an entire civilization's approach to survival. "I thought I was choosing a pet," she said finally. "Instead, I chose a teacher who showed me that our greatest strength was something we had been trying to eliminate." "What was that?" "The ability to learn and change," Zara said. "To admit when we're wrong and try something different. To find strength in diversity rather than weakness." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "Your people aren't weak, Zara. You're just learning to be strong in a different way." As they walked through the garden, Zara reflected on everything that had changed since that day in the human holding facility on New Terra. She had chosen Ben because something about his calm confidence had intrigued her. She hadn't understood then that his confidence came from a fundamentally different approach to existence. Where Vulcans sought to control and perfect, humans adapted and improvised. Where Vulcans eliminated variables, humans embraced diversity. Where Vulcans feared change, humans saw opportunity. The alien girl finally understood what it meant to choose a human. It meant choosing to see uncertainty not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a source of infinite possibility. It meant accepting that sometimes the most important solutions come from the most unexpected places. Most importantly, it meant learning that true strength comes not from perfection, but from the courage to keep growing and changing in an uncertain universe. The choice that had seemed so simple had transformed not just her own life, but the future of an entire civilization. And Ben was right. When you embrace uncertainty, you open up possibilities you never imagined.